Okay, next up is going to be Sachin Patel. Sachin is the Associate Director of QC Systems at Biogen. His team oversees the lifecycle management and maintenance activities for several analytical instruments and equipment systems across global quality control and manufacturing areas. Over his 20-plus year career in the pharma and biotech space, he has grown fond of using technology and sound problem-solving skills to support resolution of compliance gaps across business areas. Today, he'll be speaking about life after data integrity remediation, a journey of compliance. So welcome. Thank you, Sachin.
So I'm Sachin Patel. Just want to give a little background about myself. Kind of what was mentioned earlier, we have 20 years plus experience in the biotech space and pharma. Initially started out in process development, which was a fun time period, is coming right out of school. And so you didn't have to have a lot of rules. You ended up just kind of doing your pilot plant work. You did it, you get to work as many hours as you wanted. Didn't really have any requirements at home, so I got to do whatever I wanted. One thing I learned is when I had to do my first batch record review, that was quite an interesting feat. We spent hours and hours and hours doing these studies, and then it comes back with all these little flags and papers, and we're like, what the heck's going on? What did we do wrong? And it turns out to be GDP. And so that's probably the maddest I'd ever been when I first got out of school. However, when I moved into more of a regulated space, I got into analytical instrumentation. And so we did CQV, new lab startup, relocations, data integrity, and software upgrades. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the data integrity project that we went through, kind of what life was like before data integrity hit, and then kind of a little bit into the remediation aspect of it, and then kind of the future of DI. And so the past, AKA the good old days. Back in the day when we had an audit, we had three distinct areas that I'm used to dealing with. We'd have the business. The business would worry about the method transfer and the validation of the method. We had assay testing, and then they would go through the procedure, and then you would do personal training. And so they would check GDP. And then it was on to the next. It was like, okay, what instrumentation is that lab analyst using? They would call me from my desk. I'd come in, we'd go over the protocols. We'd talk about the Part 11 compliance the assessments that we'd completed, any protocols. This was back when we had paper. And so it was really easy just to bring the binder and go through it. And then at the time, our official record was either paper or we uploaded things into LIMS. And then we brought in IT that managed perfect enterprise applications. They went through the CSV process, whether we had LIMS or not, and then any of the user acceptance training. And so the picture I kind of outlined is, here's a neighborhood where we have three separate houses, and we each managed our own homes. Now, we would talk to each other. Obviously, my team was within IT, so I would work closely with IT when I needed something. And then I would interface with the business. And then same thing, the business would interface with IT. But we really didn't manage what we all were doing together. And so then came a changing of the tides. The inspector started to ask a few different questions. They started to ask more detailed questions about the application capabilities, system administration, and then they were very data focused. And so from a time period where I'd be at my desk, it moved to, I need you in the hallway, just in case there's a question. And then it came to, Sachin, I need you in the lab when we're walking around with the inspectors. And so one example, three examples I like to call out is, show me the application. Typically, the analyst would go through the application, show them how they run their assay, and that was it. But then, like I said, they started to ask deeper questions. So they said, bring me your system administrator. Because I had supported the validation, I was a backup system administrator, or at least I had rights as a system administrator from supporting the validation. And we'd walk through the application. But then they'd say, hey, show me the recycling bin on the computer, something I wasn't expecting. And then you open it to check if there's any files in there. Which was a different mindset altogether for me. And then they said, show me your real recycling bin, because they want to look inside that recycling bin to see if there's any data that's been thrown away. So it's pretty interesting. Like I mentioned, who are your system administrators? That was a question that we used to validate when we were in our own home. We would validate the system and say, all right, you guys take care of who's going to be your system administrator. It's usually a ticket to IT, and then we figure out in the back end who's going to help support it. And then ultimately, where's your raw data and is it backed up? That's typically a task that we do at validation. But it was just the deeper questions that they would ask during an audit. And then the time started showing where we started hearing about all these 483s that were popping up. And then it was about shared logins, not being able to trace your data, audit trails being disabled, systems that you could delete data. And so when we started seeing this trend, Biogen stepped up to the plate and started getting funding or whatnot to start a initiative to start getting more focus on DI. And so embarking on a new journey to DI remediation, ultimately, we came up with understanding that data integrity is essential. It impacts our patients, our customers, product supply, ability to be licensed, and our brand reputation. And so ultimately, our team had created a global data integrity directive and regulations internally. And then we had to look a little closer to understand that DI spans across the organization. It's not just the QC lab. It's manufacturing. It's our R&D space, right? We want to protect that data. Once again, we saw a growing number of observations across the industry. So we said, all right, let's look a little deeper. Let's look at our gaps and do some internal assessments. And then we also recognized there was an increased focus on data itself and audit trails that are associated with that data. And so our first in line was our QC labs. We're the first ones to kind of hit the ground running in terms of DI. And so let me talk a little bit about our gap assessments. We actually had to go back to the basics of validation. We went back and looked at our e-records, e-cigs, security and access controls, and those are typically assessments that we do at validation. However, some of these assessments were done many years ago, and we had to kind of rethink the process. We said, all right, we have e-records, but why aren't we doing e-cigs? Is there a reason? And that was merely tied to we were paper, and we don't need e-cigs for that. And so we started to think a little more critically and say, all right, maybe we can utilize this e-cig to kind of save us on the back end of testing. Critical data, I think that was a key question that we went to our partners, our customers, and said, hey, what is your critical data? Can we understand your business process? How are you going through your process from end to end? How are you doing your data review? Are you printing data? Are you scanning the packet? Are you uploading it? And then it's also understanding the application. What are the capabilities of the audit trail? What is the audit trail telling us? Who has access to it? Who can open it? And then ultimately our procedures. Our procedures did not have the delineation of segregation of duties. We ended up having to kind of build that framework inside each procedure for each application family. And so when we did our deeper dive, we kind of treated it like a 5 whys assessment. Once again, do you have your source data? Is it readily available? These are key questions that we went to each lab area, each instrument owner, and we went in as a group setting and try to figure out this information. Are you reviewing your source data? I think most people said, hey, well, I printed it. Isn't that good enough? And then from the regulations, we started to learn, hey, you should be looking at your data at the application. Are you doing a review of your metadata? I think that was the one thing when you take a closer look at the audit trails and your critical scientific data, you want to make sure is your metadata aligned in addition to the data that you get that's printed out or that's electronic. Like I mentioned earlier, do we have proper segregation of duties? Do we have someone that is a system administrator that has no interest in the data, that their role in itself is locked down enough to where they can't change anything that's required for a routine user? And then have we validated our system for intended use? I know a lot of areas rely on the vendor documentation, but we need to go one step further and test out our business process to make sure it's aligned. And the best way to answer this is to do data process mapping. And it's pretty much an end-to-end layout, almost like a Visio diagram, where you go through from end to end to understand where your data is, where's the critical data, where are the areas that have high level of concern, and we outline those risks based off of how you build out your data process map. periodic review. That was the one thing that we had implemented for analytical instruments, is something that was required for enterprise applications, but we included this for analytical instruments. So every 2 years, we'll go through the system to make sure it stays in a validated state. And then self-inspection. We wanted to make sure that, in addition to not having to wait directly on a regulatory inspection to find these issues, are we doing lab walkthroughs? Are we finding these on our own through internal audits to try to fix these instead of trying to bandage them? And then so ultimately, our DI remediation project, once again, I'd mentioned QC was the number one kind of focus. And then we moved into manufacturing, label pack, and then we looked at enterprise systems, and then engineering and technology. And as you can see, there's quite a few things that we looked at: access control, administration, like I'd mentioned, source data, e-cigs, logbooks, audit trails. Long-term archiving, that's probably another thing that we had to take a deeper look in, and what applications are we using to archive our data? What is that retention period? These are huge conversations that we had with the business. And then we implemented a data governance model. And this is where we made sure that, especially with remediation, that it had strong collaboration with the business, IT, and quality. And that was the one thing that I really enjoyed about the project, even though it was uncovering problems and trying to fix them, is that we all had one goal in mind, was to remove these data integrity gaps. And so I could always go to my IT business partners and say, hey, how do I deal with this issue with this particular piece of equipment? And they would be readily available. They provided the resources and what was needed to kind of move forward. So by building that strong collaboration, we had stakeholders that were responsible for being a part of these data governance meetings. And so we had board members, which were senior leaders across different areas of the company. And then we had project team members. And so these project team members would work with the business to help identify other issues that maybe weren't part of the remediation project. And so it was a structured forum. You had opportunity to give status updates about the project in itself. And then if there's any new data integrity issues, concerns, and then a formal way to request funding if you needed more to support your project. And then there's opportunity to learn issues outside of QC and manufacturing. That's where I focus the most, but it was interesting to hear other issues in R&D or TD or something, another space that I'm not used to. So it's interesting to see kind of their issues and concerns that they had. And we had a cadence of a monthly meeting, and we continue to keep that going. And so data integrity 101, building culture. These are key terms. I know everyone around here has been involved with quite a bit ever since the implementation of DI, ALCOA. And so I can remember going through this project. In the beginning, you could walk around and no one knew what you were talking about. And so we had to really build training throughout the company. And so essentially now, I think people are asking those questions. I think when you bring in an application, they are asking, hey, where are the audit trails? How do I know what's attributable? What is contemporaneous, right? So these are things that people are already thinking about. Now it's built into their psyche. But in the beginning, it was just interesting. So it's nice to see when you go to an audit and the inspectors now say, I don't have questions for you, but I want to talk directly to the analyst. And they'll ask these detailed questions about DI. And those people are able to step up and speak up, right? And so they're not as scared anymore. And so I enjoy seeing that. So also, in addition to the governance project, we did have DI champions. And so we had different leaders, volunteers from different areas of the business that would step up to be DI champions. So once again, they'd be team members that we would recruit to say, hey, bring up a topic. Is there something that you saw on a website that had an issue, something that we should bring up to the table? We had forums that we had monthly as well. DI walkthroughs. We had an opportunity to pull team members together, and we tried to shuffle around which area managers were looking into which labs. So chemistry would look into virology, or we'd have biochem going to manufacturing. But ultimately, we would pull together a team, go to a particular lab, and then ask them just general questions about the system, how they use it, Are they following the procedure? It was just an informal way just to kind of see if they have a good understanding of the process. Like I mentioned earlier, periodic review, we implemented that. We were ensuring that, are we doing our audit trail reviews properly? Are we doing our data backups? Things that you should typically have implemented. We updated our validation process. And so that was the one thing, is that I had to ensure that my guiding documents for validation included the proper data assessments, something that we did not have to do in the past. We included risk assessments. That's another thing that we utilize, risk assessments, to understand if we need to do additional negative testing. It just made a stronger data validation packet. And then we had audit trail verification in the validation, and then any type of data controls, whether it's locking down folders or whatnot. So unfortunately, when a validation used to take only a month to do, now it can take maybe 3 months or 6 months. And when you have a very needy lab, that can be significant when you have to have those delays. And we also implemented at new employee orientation. We actually have a dedicated DI training that all new employees have to do. So I really enjoy the way that the team stepped up and incorporated this. And then ultimately, the future in DI, how to adapt and survive. It's interesting that, instruments are always evolving. And so you're always learning about what new functions and aspects that these new applications have. But it's important to evaluate some automated options or functions. I think if we can get data moved directly to its final location without having to have that interface in between with the SME directly, I think that would be critical. Building stronger safeguards. I know some applications have a SaaS component that you can use for, user administration. I think that's something that we can evaluate. I know it's difficult to bring in. Are there third-party applications that we can use for compliance? So like LabX or Compliance Builder. Those are some things that we use to kind of reduce some of the gaps that we see. And then are there new options? Do we have AI implementation? I mean, that's very early stage. I've definitely have not looked into it, but I think that's the direction of where everything's going. So it'd be interesting to see how we would utilize that. We need to make sure we continue cross-functional collaboration. I think no one team can fix DI issues. You need to have a large stakeholder group to get together, and it requires everyone to monitor. We can't just rely on the validation team to keep an eye on it once in a while. We need everyone to keep an eye on it and then kind of raise their voice and concerns. Right now, we're going through major cybersecurity initiatives, I think like with every company. So we can understand with the cybersecurity measures that we're putting in, are there additional security measures that can help? Also, are there security measures that are hurting the application? That's the thing that maybe people don't look into. And then are there additional options to support, securing our critical data? And so, in conclusion, obviously it's very difficult to find a perfect system with no data integrity concerns. But until then, let's always try to refine the business process. There's always room for improvement. I think at a minimum, we should try to remove any DI traps. I think that's the thing that we fall into, and that's the thing that these inspectors look at. I think it's just the same types of questions. And when you keep stumbling over the same issues, there's something that you have to resolve. Keeping core data integrity timelines and historical content readily available. Even though I've been on this project, I was on the project 6 years ago, the turnover within that team has been significant. And so unfortunately, they keep coming back to me when it comes to, hey, what did we do 5 years ago, 6 years ago, what did we do? And so having that content readily available, whether it's presentations, these assessments, just even a phone tree of all the people that are still here supporting those projects, I think that's really critical. And then holding our vendors accountable. I think that's the one thing that I always have to tell a vendor when they have terrible software. And so that's the one thing that I think if a group of us can do that they can build something that works for us, especially when it comes to DI. Because they say they're part 11, and I know in the beginning they put the sticker on there, but it was nowhere close to being part 11. And so kind of giving them that feedback that, hey, you need to come back with something better or I'll stop spending my money with you, would be huge. And I think if we could have that partnership with these vendors, I think it'd be important. And that's it. Any questions?
Oh, So for when you went through the different systems, manufacturing and QC, especially, either good or bad, what was maybe one or two key differences you saw, and whether it could be people, could be systems, between those two groups?
Between the two groups? Yes,
Yeah.
yes. No, that's a great question. What I saw was that QC was definitely more aware of their process. I think the way that they were trained, they were kind of trained to ensure that they knew the ins and outs of the application. In the manufacturing space, that was the one thing that we had to kind of take a step forward and kind of do more teaching, because I think they wanted to minimize the manufacturing team members' capabilities on the piece of equipment. They wanted them to kind of collect the data, push the button, put it in the batch record. And so I think that level of teaching was huge, because having to teach someone, hey, you need to go a little bit deeper into this application and then look at an audit trail, was an eye-opening experience of how many people did not want to do that. But over time, with support of management, it became a required activity. And so obviously we had to make it in like a work instruction type of format without multi-pages of a system admin procedure. But yes, it was tough. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for the talk. Could you just talk through how you prioritized? Because when I saw your list of all the things that you had to do, whether it was LES or checking this, checking that, having this, document this, training, how did you prioritize what to do first and then get the buy-in from everybody across those different stakeholder groups?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So when we did our gap assessments, I think that's where we started to kind of shuffle out what were the most critical items. And so I think when it came down to, if it was simple as, hey, I needed to turn on an e-cig, right? We looked at, two components. One, it's which systems are being used the most that probably have the most critical data on. We tried to target those first. But also there were systems that, hey, these are quick wins. Let's go ahead and do it. We were just very fortunate that with the funding that we had a huge team support this. And so we had daily scrums to kind of go through, hey, which systems we're going to tackle. And then also we had review meetings every week to keep track and progress. We had IT leadership. We had project managers on the IT side. We had my whole team was dedicated towards it. And so, yeah, it's a combination, not truly answer your question 100%, but we did try to understand which system is the most critical, but then also understanding we had to still run the business. And so we had to kind of jug around those timelines. Perfect.
Any other questions?
Okay, so thank you.